The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through Le Jardin's floor-to-ceiling windows, making the crystal chandeliers sparkle like morning dew. Sarah Miller adjusted her crisp black apron and surveyed her section with practiced eyes. After 6 years at one of Manhattan's most prestigious restaurants, she had developed an almost sixth sense for which tables would be trouble and which would help her reach her daily targets. The subtle scent of fresh-baked bread and seared scallops wafted from the kitchen as she finished polishing the silverware at table 7. Le Jardin wasn't just a job for her. It was her domain. She knew every scratch on the mahogany tables, every wine vintage in their cellar, and exactly which regulars preferred their martinis with a twist versus an olive. The soft chime of the entrance bell drew her attention. Sarah looked up, and her perfectly maintained smile faltered slightly. A teenager, probably 16 or 17, stood awkwardly in the entrance. He was remarkably tall and lanky, wearing a navy hoodie that had seen better days and jeans that appeared to have been hastily thrown on. His brown hair fell slightly into his eyes, and he kept pushing it back with long, elegant fingers. The only elegant thing about him, Sarah thought dismissively. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone carrying that particular note of polite skepticism that veteran servers had perfected. The kind that said, "I don't think you belong here, but I'm too professional to say it outright." The boy straightened up, reaching his full height, which was admittedly impressive. "Yes, I'd like a table for one, please." His voice was soft but clear, with the kind of refined accent that Sarah usually associated with Upper East Side prep schools, which made his appearance all the more puzzling. Sarah glanced at the reservation book, though she knew there was plenty of space at this hour. "I'm not sure we can accommodate you at the moment," she said, her eyes lingering pointedly on his scuffed sneakers. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at the casual bistro down the street. Their prices are more..." She paused deliberately. Accessible. A flicker of something, disappointment, amusement, crossed the boy's face. "I understand your concern," he said, reaching into his pocket. Sarah tensed slightly, expecting him to pull out crumpled bills to prove he could pay. Instead, he produced a sleek black credit card. "I'd still prefer to dine here if possible." Sarah's professional training warred with her instincts. The card looked genuine enough, but everything else about this kid screamed wrong place. Still, she couldn't outright refuse service without cause. "Very well," she said coolly. "Follow me." She led him to table 12, a perfectly acceptable table, but not one of the prime window seats she reserved for her real customers. As she handed him the menu, she couldn't help but notice his posture was impeccable, his movements graceful despite his casual attire. There was something familiar about his features too, but she couldn't quite place it. "Our chef's tasting menu is quite extensive," she said, her tone suggesting it might be beyond his comprehension. "Perhaps you'd prefer to start with the à la carte options." "The tasting menu will be fine," he replied quietly, not rising to her bait. "And a sparkling water, please." Sarah nodded curtly and turned on her heel, already planning to give more attention to her other tables. After all, this was Le Jardin, and she had standards to maintain. She never noticed the thoughtful way the boy observed her departure, nor the small notebook he pulled out alongside his phone. What she did notice, however, was how her other guests, the ones in their designer suits and elegant dresses, kept glancing at table 12 with poorly concealed curiosity. It irritated her that this scruffy teenager was disrupting the carefully cultivated atmosphere of her section. She'd make sure he got his meal, but he certainly wouldn't be encouraged to return. If only she'd known who she was serving, and more importantly, what the next day would bring. The evening service flowed around table 12 like a river around a stone. Sarah maintained her orchestrated dance between tables, ensuring her preferred guests received impeccable attention while keeping her interactions with the teenager minimal and frigid. When she finally approached to take his order, she found him studying the wine list with surprising familiarity. "The wine selection isn't required with the tasting menu," she said, the suggestion clear in her voice. "And of course, I'll need to see identification for any alcohol service." "Just curious about the vintages," he replied, setting the list aside. "My father always says you can tell a lot about a restaurant by how they curate their wine cellar." His comment carried a weight she missed entirely. As the courses began arriving, Sarah's subtle campaign of disapproval continued. She was never openly rude. She had too much professional pride for that. But her actions spoke volumes. When he asked about the composition of a particular sauce, she provided only the briefest explanation, though she was known for her detailed descriptions to other guests. When he requested fresh ground pepper, she took 3 minutes to return with the mill, having prioritized refilling water glasses at her other tables. What Sarah failed to notice, consumed by her own prejudices, were the small details that might have given her pause. The way he correctly identified the specific type of truffle in the risotto, his perfect posture and table manners, the careful way he documented each course on his phone, occasionally making notes in a small leather notebook. Between courses, she overheard fragments of his conversations with other staff members, the busboy he thanked by name, the sommelier he engaged in a surprisingly knowledgeable discussion about Spanish wines. But Sarah had already made up her mind about who and what he was, and these inconsistencies bounced off her preconceptions like rain off a window. "Is everything satisfactory?" she asked before the dessert course, her tone suggesting she expected complaints she could dismiss. "The food is excellent," he responded thoughtfully. "The kitchen's timing is precise, though I've noticed some inconsistencies in the service standards between tables." He made the observation without accusation, but Sarah felt her spine stiffen. "I assure you, our service standards are uniform," she replied coldly, even as she delayed his dessert to attend to a wealthy couple who had just been seated in her section. When she finally returned with his dessert, a delicate chocolate soufflé that was the restaurant's signature, she found him making more notes. "I hope you're not planning to write a review," she said, unable to completely hide her disdain. "We value the opinions of experienced diners." He looked up at her then, and for the first time, she caught a glimpse of something in his eyes. Not anger or hurt, but a kind of measured assessment that made her slightly uncomfortable. "Everyone's opinion has value, Ms. Miller," he said quietly, reading her name tag. "Sometimes the most valuable perspectives come from unexpected sources." As the evening wound down, Sarah watched him sign the check without a second glance at the total, leaving a perfectly calculated 20% tip, neither too little to suggest dissatisfaction, nor too much to appear showy. It irritated her that she couldn't find fault even with this. He gathered his notebook and stood, his height once again surprising her. "Thank you for an illuminating evening," he said, and something in his tone should have warned her. But Sarah was already turning away, eager to focus on guests she deemed more worthy of her attention. She had no idea that in less than 24 hours, she would be replaying every moment of this service in her mind, seeing each interaction in a painfully different light. The lesson that was coming would change not just her approach to service, but her entire worldview. But for now, she simply watched him leave, already forgetting table 12 in favor of the next day's reservations. What she didn't see was the young man pausing outside the restaurant's gleaming windows, looking back thoughtfully as he made one final note in his leather-bound book. Nor did she notice him nodding to the restaurant's security cameras that had recorded every interaction of the evening in perfect detail. Sarah arrived for her morning shift the next day, feeling confident about an upcoming meeting with management. She'd heard rumors about a new training initiative, and with her years of experience, she expected to be chosen as a lead trainer. As she hung up her coat in the staff room, Elena, the morning hostess, gave her an odd look. "Mr. Romano wants to see you in the office right away," Elena said, her voice carrying a note of concern. "And Sarah, the owners are here." Sarah's confidence wavered slightly. The owners rarely visited during morning hours. Still, she straightened her uniform and made her way to the management office, mentally reviewing her recent performance. Sure, there had been that awkward situation with the teenager yesterday, but surely that wasn't important enough to warrant attention. The first thing she noticed upon entering was that Mr. Romano, the usually self-assured general manager, looked uncomfortable. The second was the imposing figure of Donald Trump himself, standing by the window. But it was the third person in the room that made her blood run cold. The teenager from yesterday, now dressed impeccably in a tailored suit that transformed his entire presence. "Ms. Miller," Mr. Romano began, "I believe you served Barron yesterday evening." The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. The familiar features, the refined accent, the wine knowledge. She had spent an entire evening condescending to the owner's son. Sarah felt the color drain from her face. "Please sit down," Barron said, gesturing to a chair. His voice was the same gentle tone from yesterday, but now it carried an authority she had willfully ignored before. "We have some things to discuss." Sarah sank into the chair, her legs feeling weak. I had no idea," she began. "That was the point," Donald Trump interjected, but Barron raised a hand slightly. "Dad, please, let me handle this." He turned to Sarah, opening the leather notebook she now recognized from yesterday. "Miss Miller, I want to share some observations with you." What followed was the most thorough and measured analysis of service standards Sarah had ever heard. Barron went through his experience methodically, comparing her treatment of him with her interactions with other guests. He noted timing differences down to the minute, variations in language and tone, and subtle discouragements that she had thought invisible. "The most interesting thing," he continued, "wasn't the different treatment itself. It was how it contrasted with your excellent service to other guests. You clearly know how to provide outstanding hospitality. You simply chose not to, based on assumptions about my worth as a guest." Sarah felt tears threatening but forced them back. "I deserve to be fired," she said quietly. "Actually," Barron replied, "I don't think so. This got everyone's attention, including his father's. Firing you would be easy, but it wouldn't address the larger issue. Tell me, Ms. Miller, in your 6 years here, how many other guests have you prejudged this way? Not just teenagers. Maybe someone's clothes weren't quite right, or their accent wasn't what you expected." The question hit hard because Sarah knew the answer. She had always prided herself on maintaining the restaurant's standards, but now she was forced to confront how often those standards had really been prejudices in disguise. "What you did yesterday was wrong," Barron continued, "but your skills as a server aren't in question. What needs to change is how you decide who deserves those skills." He pulled out a folder. I have a different proposition, one that might help ensure no other guest experiences what I did yesterday. Donald Trump moved forward, a mix of pride and surprise on his face as he watched his son handle the situation. Mr. Romano relaxed slightly, sensing that the outcome might not be what he had feared. "Before I tell you what I have in mind," Barron said, "I need to know, are you willing to learn from this? Really learn, not just apologize and continue as before?" Sarah looked at this poised young man, so different from the teenager she had dismissed just yesterday, and felt something shift in her worldview. "Yes," she said firmly, finding her voice. "Yes, I am." What happened next would change not just Sarah's career, but the entire culture of Le Jardin. And it began with Barron Trump pulling out a proposal for a new training program, one that would turn this moment of shame into an opportunity for lasting change. The training program began the following week. What Sarah had expected to be a humiliating experience transformed into something unexpectedly profound. Barron's proposal was both innovative and comprehensive, a complete overhaul of the restaurant's service culture, with Sarah playing a central role in its development and implementation. "The best teachers are often those who've learned the hardest lessons," Barron explained during their first planning session. They sat in the empty restaurant before opening, surrounded by training materials and service manuals. "Your experience, both your years of expertise and your recent enlightenment, makes you uniquely qualified to lead this change." The program they developed went far beyond typical service training. Sarah found herself working closely with Barron, who showed up regularly in various forms of dress, from suits to hoodies, to help train staff in recognizing and overcoming their unconscious biases. They created scenarios that challenged servers' assumptions, documented real interactions, and developed concrete strategies for ensuring consistent service standards regardless of a guest's appearance or demeanor. One morning, about 3 months into the program, Sarah arrived to find a young woman in ripped jeans and a band t-shirt sitting at table 12, the very table where her own journey had begun. The woman was one of their test guests, part of the program's practical training component. Sarah watched as Elena, a server she was mentoring, approached the table. "Excuse me," Sarah overheard the test guest say, "but is your Wagyu really A5 grade? It seems unusually well priced." It was a knowledge check, designed to test both service attitude and product knowledge. Sarah held her breath. Elena's response was everything Sarah could have hoped for: engaged, informative, and completely free of the condescension Sarah herself would have shown just months ago. Later, during the feedback session, Sarah found herself fighting back tears of pride. "You've created something remarkable here," Barron said, reviewing the latest training results in what had become their regular weekly meetings. "The service metrics are showing consistent improvement across all guest demographics." Indeed, the changes were measurable. Guest satisfaction scores had risen across the board, but most notably among younger diners and those who didn't fit the traditional fine dining patron profile. The restaurant was becoming known not just for its food and elegant atmosphere, but for its genuinely welcoming service to all guests. 6 months after the incident, Sarah stood before the management teams of all Trump restaurant properties, presenting the training program that would soon be rolled out across the entire organization. As she concluded her presentation, she noticed Barron in the back of the room, dressed in his signature hoodie, a small smile playing at his lips. "The true measure of hospitality," she told her audience, "isn't how well we treat our most obviously prestigious guests. It's how we treat every person who walks through our doors, regardless of their appearance or our assumptions about them." Later that evening, during a celebration dinner at Le Jardin, Sarah found herself seated at table 12 with Barron and his father. The symmetry wasn't lost on her. "You know," she said, looking at Barron, "you could have just had me fired that day. Most people would have." "Most people," he replied, "look for justice. I prefer to look for opportunity." He glanced around the bustling restaurant, where servers were providing attentive service to an eclectic mix of guests. Besides, isn't this a better outcome? Sarah watched as a young server warmly greeted a teenager in a leather jacket who'd just walked in alone. The server's genuine smile and welcoming attitude spoke volumes about how much had changed. "We're not perfect yet," she admitted. "Biases run deep, and changing them takes constant work. But we're getting better every day." A year after that fateful evening service, Sarah received a promotion to Director of Service Culture for all Trump restaurant properties. Her first act in the new role was to institute a simple but powerful policy. Every new hire, from dishwasher to executive chef, would hear the story of Table 12 and the lesson it taught about judging others. The leather notebook Barron had used that night now sat framed in the staff room, open to his notes from that evening. Below it, a simple plaque read, "Every guest has a story. Our job is to honor it, not judge it." As for Sarah, she kept her original server's uniform pressed and ready in her office. Once a month, she would don it and work a full service shift, reminding herself and others that true hospitality knows no prejudice. And every time she passed table 12, she smiled, remembering the lesson that had changed not just her career, but her entire worldview.